right around the corner. All right, so first of all, doesn't that look pretty tasty, actually? And I guess this is what we all kind of earmark the 4th of July for. That's kind of what I always think about is sweet corn and fresh watermelon and fireworks. So always good, especially if it's coming from our own garden. But did you know that corn is actually a grass? It's a grass because it's in the Poaceae family. That's a mouthful. It's one of those crops that is going to be really useful in our crop rotations because it can actually help us break up some pest and disease cycles. It's again because it's the only crop in our gardens that's in that grass family, except for weeds, of course. But we got a lot of different types besides sweet corn. We've got dent corn, flint corn, even flour and popcorn. And popcorn is something we're starting to see a little uptick in, especially with kids wanting to do some hands-on gardening. So if those are some things that you're interested in, especially for milling for flour and things like that, we do have a list of available varieties that I can send you for those. But corn is a monoecious plant, like you see here. That means that both the female and the male flower structures are going to be on that same plant. So corn's kind of cool, especially when it comes to kids, because the tassel or the tassel, depending on where you're from, it's actually what is going to contain the male pollen. And it's the lateral ear shoots coming off that contain the female flowers, like you see right here. The silks are the female flower parts, so think about style and stigma, and that's where we're able to catch that pollen that's dropping from the tassels to basically enable fertilization to occur. So the other unique thing about corn is that each one of these little individual kernels is actually going to be fertilized. So in reality, that means that every single one of those little kernels is actually a fruit. And so within each one of those little fruits is actually what we call the embryo and the endosperm. And that's what is help supporting that plant or giving it the energy basically for germination. That's what we are going to be the most interested in as far as humans. It's the sweet part of the plant. That's what that's the edible portion. I was just sitting here thinking it's not just humans because deer and raccoons, because I'm always fighting the raccoons every year, but they also find that endosperm pretty tasty as well. So I'm always fighting them off the 4th of July. But anyway, that's where the sweetness is going to come from in a kernel of corn. So you can kind of see that a little bit better here. It almost looks a little bit like a tooth. So what does make that, again, endosperm so special? Well, again, that's where the sweetness factor comes from. That's where we're getting that conversion of sugar to starch. And that's going to be one of the most important elements of sweet corn breeding and selection. That's where we're getting all those different cultivars that are released each year. And I'm sure each one of you have your own favorite. You know, peaches and cream was a pretty popular cultivar a few years ago, still seems to remain pretty high on the list. But anyway, it's all those differences and those characteristics that are giving us the broad range of sweet corn to eat and to grow in our garden. So in the publication that you're going to get all of these different cultivars that we recommend here in Tennessee. But you know, here's a question for you. How many of you actually know what all these little letters actually mean when you purchase sweet corn? Well, when we have what we call normal sugary, that's this SU right here, that is probably our most traditional sweet corn. That's the one that's going to have a creamy texture, and it's going to have a pretty fast sugar to starch conversion going on. And then when we get into the sugary enhanced, or the SE, and then also the shrunken, the SH2, that means that they're going to have even a little bit more creamier texture. They're actually going to have a little bit of a crunch or a little crispness to that, and often very much sweeter. So this is something you're actually going to see these descriptors when you purchase sweet corn. So now hopefully you know a little bit about what those are. In addition, you actually may see extra tender, ultra sweet, and triple sweet on on that packet as well. And all that is telling us is that's genetics. It's basically sweet corn breeding. It's combining sweet corn types to provide storage quality. It's going to give us a sweeter flavor, a creamier texture, and actually a more tender kernel, believe it or not. So if you think back to some of those older cultivars, just like our normal white corn, that's pretty much what I grew up on. But think about that kernel. It's a little bit crispier. If you eat it, it'll literally like shoot out at other people rather than kind of running down your chin. So in essence, we're wanting to breed in more of the sugary stuff that runs down your chin instead of going on everybody else. That's one way to look at it. But let's talk a little bit about planting, because with the weather the way it has been, maybe with the exception of last night, it's pretty much corn planting across the state, even here in East Tennessee. We can actually plant corn a little bit before that frost-free date. Now, remember, it is going to be a warm season annual, but if we're going to enable the earliest possible harvest, you can seed directly into the soil a few days beforehand. So in East Tennessee, we typically will say April 15th to June 30th. In West Tennessee, that's going to range a little bit more. It's April 15th to more like mid-June and even late June, depending on some of those cultivars. First things first, this is something that a lot of home gardeners will run into. Remember that corn is when pollinated, just like I was showing you here from the tassel. Remember, that's where the male part of that plant is, and that's where the pollen is. And we want it to reach this end of the corn, the ear of the corn right here. But anyway, if we have this right here, which is one single row in the garden, we're not going to get much pollination going on, right? So that's why we prefer to tell you to grow in blocks in your garden, at least 4 rows of corn. Make sure that you've got similar days to harvest, because again, that's going to help support that pollination. Plus also building up your ecosystem to just help draw in those pollinators as well into your garden. So we all know, I harp on this all the time, this time of year, it gets warm and we get excited and we think, oh, wow, you know, because I think we got up to almost 90 degrees here Saturday, but that's air temperature, and that's going to be a lot different from the soil temp, which is what you see pictured here. That 55 degrees in the soil is going to be a lot different than 55 degrees ambient air temperature. Okay, so it's going to be a little bit cooler warming that soil up than what it is what we're actually feeling on our skin. So the thing about it is, make sure to invest in one of these soil thermometers. It will really go a long way. We'll generally recommend 55 to 60, but the warmer that soil temp is, the more that germination speed will increase, and you won't have a lot of germination losses. Sometimes we get into a situation here in East Tennessee where we might hit a cold spell, and I mean, we're still kind of within that window that it could happen. I don't even want to wager a guess with what Mother Nature's been throwing at us for the last year or so. But if we were to get into some sustained temperatures like we did last night, like maybe 3 consecutive days, then that's going to alter that soil temperature. So make sure that you check that before planting seed into the ground, because it's basically just going to sit there and not do anything. And oftentimes we'll have home gardeners that come in that maybe plant during a time like that each spring. That's why they're not seeing germination like they normally would. The other word of caution here is going back to that little chart I showed you on all the little initials. If you have an SE or an SH2 type corn, we actually want to bump that soil temp up to about 65. So basically, in a nutshell, the older that cultivar is, that corn cultivar, the earlier it can go into the ground. The newer type of cultivar it is, we actually need that soil temp a little bit higher. Now, what you see here is a bright pink on the corn, and what is that telling us? A lot of sweet corn that we purchase is actually treated with a fungicide. And what that's doing is helping us increase germination. So keep in mind that if you're buying any kind of heirloom corn seed that is not treated with the fungicide, it's going to be a little bit slower to germinate in the spring. Anything that's going to be treated with a fungicide, it's actually going to increase that germination factor a little bit. that soil temp. It's going to help mitigate some of that soil temp as well. Treated seeds can be pink. Sometimes they'll even be a bright yellow or even bright orange, depending on those cultivars. And that's what is going to be your indicator that it has, in fact, been treated. When we do think about direct seeding corn, we're usually going to do that about 1 to 2 inches in depth and about 4 to 6 inches between the seeds, like you see here. Final within row spacing of plants typically going to be about 6 to 12 inches. So seeding is going to be done about 4-inch spacings, but you still might need to go back and thin some of that out after it emerges from the soil. Row spacing, typically about 36 inches, but you're going to have some of those cultivars that are going to be early maturing, and smaller cultivars you may need to plant on about a 30-inch row spacing. So again, that's going to vary. I'm just telling you, it's going to be kind of all across the board, but make sure you read that planting pack and really go by that, because each one of these cultivars are going to be a little bit different in the needs and requirements that they have. Now, if you're wanting sweet corn throughout the summer, there's a lot of early, mid, and late season cultivars, so you can actually plan sequentially to have a fresh harvest throughout the entire summer season. We often get the question as extension agents if you need to isolate certain corn types, and I'll go back to that picture I showed you a little bit earlier. Corn is going to be wind pollinated, so different cultivars can cross pollinate, especially if they're maturing at the same time. And you're going to have some differences in kernels that can be seen with some of those cultivars when they cross pollinate. So be wary of that. When you're growing super sweet or shrunken corn cultivars, you will typically need to separate those by about 300 foot or 12 to 14 days in silk maturity. Okay, so again, kind of keep that in mind. Make sure that you read that seed pack to know when it is going to be maturing. Think about those cultivars I talked about earlier, the flower, the flint, the dent, the popcorn. All of those are also going to be capable of doing some of that cross-pollination. And especially if we're crossing with a field corn, it can make our sweet corn very starchy, kind of tough, almost woody in texture. So if you've ever encountered that, that may be what it is. Timing of maturity is going to be really important with your corn cultivars. Now, often in July into August, we'll see cornfields that look a lot like this, right? And we just see it shriveling up and it's kind of twisted. And that's how we always know that we have entered a drought year, because when corn starts twisting, we know we don't have any water, because typically corn is one of our, I'm not going to say it's drought resistant, it's more drought tolerant than pretty much all of our other summer veggies growing in our garden. But again, when we see it doing this, we know we need to get some water to that. It's already probably stunted that growth, but don't forget that water can be beneficial to corn. Sometimes I think in our minds, when we realize it's a grass, we just kind of treat it like our grass, and we're like, it'll be fine. And again, oftentimes it is, but when it gets to this point of being stressed, you're not going to have good corn kernels actually producing. So keep an eye on that. If you are growing in smaller blocks in your garden, you can even install a little bit of a drip irrigation there. That's just going to make sure that you're getting an inch or two of water a week. And that's actually going to help improve the flavor and the starchiness, creamy texture of that corn kernel. And then what about these? Have you ever seen these in your corn plots or in field corn? These are actually what we call root suckers or side tiller. Sometimes you'll hear it just called tillering. So that doesn't mean we're going through there with a tiller or a plow. That's just the terminology for a corn sucker. Sometimes I've had producers that say that really significantly stunts production. But on the other hand, I've had growers say that it actually helps increase the yield and the production of that corn. So there's mixed studies, even from a land grant, university system, that it's kind of a mixed bag out there. But if you have extensive tillering, I would probably consider doing a little bit of row spacing or making sure that you're looking at your fertility management, because again, corn is a grass. Grasses are heavy feeders, so they're going to require a lot of nitrogen. So kind of keep that in mind. Cultivate, not a bad option here, especially with a lot of that side tillering. You want to make sure that you're not getting up close. You want to make sure that you're not going too deep, because corn is at a pretty shallow depth, and you don't want to get incur any root damage there either. If you've got small space in your garden, even mulching would be a good option to help reduce some of that weed pressure, but make sure that you get that on right as you plant the corn, because it will emerge through that straw, because otherwise weeds will take over and it becomes a nuisance. So again, like I said a few minutes ago, corn is a grass, so you're going to have to give it a lot in terms of fertilizer, more so than anything else pretty much in your garden. Pre-plant fertilization is going to be necessary. You're going to have to go back and do a side dress application. Typically we do that about this stage, 12 to 18 inches tall. And then for about every 100 foot of row, you're going to make an addition of 1 to 1.5 pounds of ammonium nitrate or urea. This is the one crop in the garden you'll hear me say that you can go with straight nitrogen. Usually I'm telling you to come off the nitrogen a little bit, because we're going to push all that to a foliage, and we're not going to have any fruit production. But corn is going to be the one crop that we're going to push more nitrogen to, because it's vegetative, and we want that corn to grow. If you can't get ammonium nitrate, calcium nitrate would be recommended. Usually that would be equivalent to about 2 to 3 pounds calcium nitrate per 100 foot of row. And I have that in a publication, so it's real easy access for you to get. Make sure that when you are applying a side dress, that you're not going down the row and like me, just swarping and tossing it out. Make sure that you're actually kind of banding that far enough away from that plant stem to prevent any kind of burning or any kind of phytotoxicity effect from that fertility application. And then if you can go through like she's doing and kind of hoe that in and water it in, then you're going to get more rapid availability, or at least time that before a rain or irrigation. So what about harvesting? We get this from homeowners especially that are new to the area. How do I know when my sweet corn is ready? And typically we'll say when those silks have actually dried down brown, but the shucks are still going to maintain that green color. We always recommend to harvest early in the morning. Be sure to cool that corn down as soon as possible. Don't leave it out in the sunshine, or otherwise it'll be sour. It doesn't smell very good, and then it won't taste very good. So storage at about 32 degrees, a little bit above 32 degrees is recommended. And it's actually better if you'll harvest or pick what you're going to eat within a few days, because the longer that ear has been picked, then it's going to lose a lot of that starch to sugar conversion. You're going to lose a lot of that sweetness, and that kernel is going to get a lot tougher. And plus you do kind of get that little sour taste to the corn as well. Now, a few things to be on the lookout for, BOLO, if you will. And we as consumers, we're kind of a persnickety bunch, because if we go to the grocery store, the farmer's market, we don't want to eat anything that has an earworm in it. But it's pretty common, actually. And it's not just in corn. I actually call this the delectable corn earworm, because if you get one, it's just good protein, y'all, so just remember that. But anyway, the corn earworm is going to be very similar to our tomato fruit worm. You may have encountered this in your garden. Anybody joining from West Tennessee, if you're familiar with cotton, this is the cotton worm, and it's going to cause that same exact kind of damage. And I say, aren't they pretty, because they consider or the variable colors, considerably different colors. It just depends on what they're feeding on. Now, the larvae like this, they're actually going to prefer to eat the foliage, but That's why we'll see them in the corn tips, because there's a lot of sweetness there. So they like it just as much as we do. And that's actually very nutritious for them as well. Usually when we think about corn earworm, this is one way you'll know it's corn earworm. It'll only enter the corn ears through the tip of the corn. And here is what the moth looks like, the corn earworm moth. So if you ever see this floating around, this is the corn earworm. So she's laying her eggs here. This is blown up, very teensy tiny, but the eggs are yellowish, very small. I don't know, half the size of a pinhead, I guess. But the unique thing about these, if you get out there with your little magnifying glass and look, they're going to be singular eggs like you see here. They're each one of them are laid individually. And fresh corn silk, that's where they want to lay those eggs. So go back to that picture. You can see what she's doing there. But the egg, it's going to hatch in about 2 to 5 days. That's going to be dependent a lot on Mother Nature and the temperature. Of course, the warmer it is, the quicker they're going to hatch. So then as soon as they hatch, this is when we're going to see all that channeling through the tip of that ear of corn. That corn is just developing. It's super sweet. Again, that's where they're going to feed. You get a lot of this excrement from the worm. That's what all that yuckiness is when we pull that out. Of course, it's still going to be edible from here back. There's no telling how much of that I've eaten in my lifetime. But once the earworm has entered to this stage, there is no effective control. So kind of remember that chemical control for corn earworm is going to require a lot of protective coverage. So we're going to have to be really proactive. And you're going to have to make sure that you're getting that coverage right in that ear zone, which is where I showed you that moth was laying her eggs. And initially, that's where we want them to get that burst of insecticide. But another thing to kind of help prevent this is the earlier that you plant, the better. We won't encounter as much damage. If we are planting in, say, mid-May into mid-June, we'll have a heavier prevalence there. So again, the earlier you can get sweet corn planted, you won't have as big of an issue. Now, what about this critter? This one very much looks similar to that corn earworm, but this is going to be the fall armyworm. And what they're going to do is this kind of chewing effect. They're going to feed on the leaves, so it's a little bit different. You'll be able to see this damage a lot more and more quickly than what you will with the corn earworm. They will attack the tassels and the ear corn, but again, you're going to have a lot more foliage density. And you can kind of see right here, this is a pretty heavy infestation here of the fall armyworm. This is actually what we would call severe feeding, and it almost looks like it's hail damage. It looks like it's been pelted in one of those thunderstorms that have been rolling through here in the last couple of weeks. We will usually, for a home gardener, say that an application of insecticide it's not going to be really economical for control of that armyworm. Applications when the larvae are large or hidden, it's just going to be largely ineffective. There's not going to be anywhere that chemical at this stage, that late in the season, is going to be able to penetrate that corn. So I'm just letting you know that if you are growing corn, you got a couple of little bandits you're going to have to wrestle with, but we don't have a lot of good control measures. Here's another one. This is the European corn borer. It's actually going to overwinter in stalks as mature larvae, and then in spring they're going to pupate and emerge as a moth. And then you're going to get egg laying. That's going to occur in May to June, but then it's going to happen again in July to August. And you're going to see this on the underside of the leaf. So I don't know if you can really tell that's a corn leaf. That's going to be on the underside. And then they're going to also feed on developing tassels as well, especially as those tassels start emerging. The larva is actually going to bore into the stalk, like you see here. You can see that excrement coming out of that stalk there. They can also do it at the ear tip. They can do it on the side of that corn or even at the base. So that's, again, it's called the borer. So that's what it's doing. You're going to have a couple generations of those a year. probably the most effective thing that you can use, and it's also an organic material, which can be effective also on the larval species of the corn earworm and the fall armyworm that we were just talking about. But that's going to be BT. That's a microbial insecticide. So if you can, when that larva first starts appearing and get that application made in a timely manner, it can be effective on those soft-bodied caterpillars. All right, now what about this one? Doesn't that just look fantastically yummy? All right, so I know some of y'all are eating supper, so I hope you're having this right here, the fungus among us. This is what we call corn smut. And I'm not really sure how you say that word, but that's what they call it in Mexico. It's actually known as a Mexican truffle. Very earthy flavored, not like our traditional mushroom that we eat. I've actually tried this before. I don't really know how to describe it, but it's kind of like a sweet mushroom, I guess, but it's still got the dirt flavor. If that, I don't know, almost like a nutty flavor too. But if you've never had this, it's a delicacy in some parts of the world. Again, pretty common to have that in Mexico, Central America, and places in South America as well. But if you're interested in this and maybe actually have this phenomena occur in your own gardens this year, I've got you a recipe on this slide, so make sure you check that out. So we're going to transition now from corn smut right into green beans. So I'm actually getting a little bit hungry, y'all, just thinking about corn and beans. But anyway, what you're looking at here is bush beans. Here we've got a little snapshot of pole beans. And then we've got our greasy beans, okay? They're all going to require a little bit different effort, a little bit different management style. But if you do go with this last one here, the greasies, the pole beans, they're going to be well worth the effort, I promise. Do remember that beans are in the Fabaceae family. Okay, so that means, again, they're a legume. So what they're doing is fixing nitrogen from the air, and it actually occurs in the roots. That's where these little nodules are that's what these are. They're colonizing along the root zone. And basically all that is nitrogen in, vast quantities that plant is going to use and store even into that soil profile for later use. So just very cool to look at those very profuse nodules on a legume plant. So that's what we call symbiotic relationship. Corn and beans, that's one reason we present those together, because corn is a very heavy nitrogen user, right? We have to push a lot of nitrogen to it. It's going to eat a lot. But what beans are going to do if we plant those close, think about three sisters, they're going to put that nitrogen right back into the soil, everything that corn is using. So that's why we call it that symbiotic relationship. It's just a cycle of nature. Now, one thing to think about with green beans is that it's kind of similar to tomatoes in terms of terminology, because we have determinate, semi-determinate, and indeterminate beans. Okay, so we're going to talk more on that as we get into the tomato class. But think about, I guess, in terms of easiness, I guess the common bean or the green bean, what I call a blue lake bean or a bush bean, those are actually going to be determinate plants. So think about determinate tomatoes. So basically what they're going to do is develop their flowers like you see here at the end of their branches. And then they're going to produce a really compact plant, less than 2 foot in height. You probably can't see that very good in this picture. And then they're going to continue to bush out, and they're going to set a bean. And once they set a bean, you pick that bean, that's all that bean's going to do. So it's just done in essence. Pole beans are going to continue to vine. Can't really see yeah, there's a few flowers right in here, but basically what they're going to do is they're indeterminate. They're just going to keep on producing leaves, producing flowers all along that stem, much like an indeterminate tomato. So they'll just keep producing. As long as you're picking, they're just going to keep producing, pretty prolific. And then kind of in the middle of that, we have half runners. And I think I actually forgot to mention that a minute ago. I said bush beans pole beans and then greasy beans. Greasy beans are a type of pole bean. But anyway, what you get in the middle is the half runner. So it's not going to require a huge amount of trellising or support like a greasy bean or a pole bean. I'm going to show you some of that here in just a few minutes. But it's not going to be that really compact, dense bush type bean either. And typically white half runners, most of you are probably going to be familiar with those. They have the green like this, but then they also have a little white bean on the inside, whereas a bush bean, you're just basically eating for the snaps. There's the half runner. All right, and then we do have some novelty cultivars that are on the market. Now, here's the other thing. In your Google Drive, I put the 2024 Home Garden Variety Trial results. Some of you may already have that, but if you've not already purchased some of your corn and bean seeds, you might want to refer back to that. That's citizen science, folks just like you all across the state of Tennessee that were growing out some of these bean varieties last year. So you'll see some of those novel beans in there. But anyway, some of these novel beans can produce purple beans like you see here. Some are going to be speckled. You'll get a pretty large range as far as the pod size as well as the bean size. Most of the newer cultivars and beans have been bred to have less strings. So that's where you're going to get that term stringless. Oftentimes you're going to hear that word snap. So sometimes you won't even hear them called green beans, depending on where you're from. I know in East Carolina, they're just called snaps. They don't even put bean in the word. Pole beans, they're going to have a little bit extended harvest season because, again, they're indeterminate. So they're going to be a lot more prolific. Kind of depending on what you're utilizing beans for. Bush beans are typically what most people will use for home canning. Pole beans typically will be dried, what we call leather breeches, and stored, sometimes even freeze those beans, but typically not really good for canning. Not to say that you can't do that, it's just always been a general preference, it seems. But again, for small space gardening or for home gardeners, bush beans pretty suitable even for raised bed situations, and you're not going to have any kind of trellis support for those. And then lima beans, I did want to just kind of throw that in here. Those are going to be larger seeded beans. You can also find lima beans that are going to be in bush bean or in the vining types. And both of those perform well here in East Tennessee as well. Sometimes you may hear lima beans referred to as butter beans. Again, just kind of dependent on where you're from. Now, when we think about these type beans, are all going to be self-pollinated, so you're not going to have a lot of movement. Think about corn. We had to have wind to help disperse that pollen from the tassels onto the ear of corn, but you're not going to have a lot of pollen between flowering, or what we refer to as outcrossing. So that means you can actually grow bush beans, pole beans, all of the half runners all together without having that worry. So that's another reason that beans are often seen in seed saving, events, because it's one of the easier crops to be able to save seed for. The only issue would be sometimes if you get real infested with insects. Sometimes insects can actually spread viruses and cause a little bit of distress on that seed for the next year. So kind of be careful with that. If you get a lot of infestation, I wouldn't save that seed. Also, when it comes to home gardening, you'll find in a lot of catalogs, you get open pollinated, and that's just going to be due to the expensive hybridization. Those are going to be a little bit more costly beans, again, just because of that outcrossing that's occurring with those different types. And then in the publication you'll get different cultivar suggestions for each one of those, the bush beans, half runners, the poles, even edamame or the edible soybean. And we're starting to see a huge uptick in those as well. Nutrition, kids seem to really like the edamame. You can actually cook that with the hull on and sprinkle a little sea salt, and it's really tasty. So as far as growing beans, just remember what we said about corn, that we could actually do that before the last frost. Be a little bit more careful with beans because they're more tender, okay? They're a more tender, warm season crop than corn. So we want to wait till after that danger of frost is passed, because beans, they're not going to like it one little bit, even if they've emerged just a smidgen. To increase that seed germination, that soil temperature really needs to be hovering around 65 degrees. If you're growing lima beans, you need to bump it on up to about 70. Lima beans really don't like anything below that. So keep that in mind. We can even get away here planting lima beans even up to the 1st of June. Another snippet of advice, just again thinking back to that symbiotic association with bacteria in the soil. Beans planted in a garden area for the first time can be inoculated. That's just going to be ensuring that we're going to have enough bacteria present to be able to colonize, like what you see here on the roots, and that's going to be called rhizobium. Some of you in some of my plant path classes, and you'll hear us talk about this, especially with tomatoes, you'll hear me call a soil pathogen rhizoc. So it is going to be within that same profile, but we actually need that to help colonize and fix that nitrogen for bacteria to help these plants grow and germinate. So kind of a unique little symbiotic relationship going on there. But anyway, this is what that looks like. Something I pulled offline, the pea and boom booster, just a good soil inoculation. Sometimes the seeds are going to be treated with a fungicide. That's just, again, just like the corn, going to help us reduce seed loss just due to seed rots or damping off, because we have a lot of that this time of year here in East Tennessee. So anytime we're increasing or adding that inoculant, that's just increasing our germination percentage. And again, you'll have that bright pink dye that will be on that seed. Now, one thing to consider too, when we think about green beans, well-drained soil, full sun are going to be needed. You don't want to have any shade. You'll see why here in just a few minutes. But pretty much beans can grow on many textured soils, including sandy soils, even clay type soils, which is a good thing because we have a lot of that here. The only thing that you want to be careful with is any soil that does this, and this is what we call forming a crust, because that can really delay or even reduce emergence of our young bean seeds. Okay. As far as pH, you want to be somewhere between 5.8 and 6.5, like with most of our other vegetable crops. But anyway, crusting can be a pretty substantial germination loss for some of our soils. How to mitigate this, you can't really do it now if you're wanting to plant in the spring, or if you encounter this after you plant in the spring. This is something you need to kind of work on in the fall of the year by incorporating organic matter and just building that soil tilth. That's where a cover crop would come in handy to help build that soil structure and alleviate some of this type symptoms. And you're probably wondering, why have you got a picture of strawberries? You're in the wrong presentation. But I want you to think back to some terminology here as well, because if you've ever heard that term day neutral, we will often correlate that with strawberries, but beans are actually going to be very similar to that, because both your bush and pole beans are going to be described as day neutral. So the length of days is not going to impact production of the bean at all. However, edamame, or the edible soybean, or soya as some people call it, are going to be really sensitive to that day length. I don't know if any of you are familiar with field soybeans, but that's why we have a lot of row croppers that are going to really look at that cultivar that's going to be appropriate for our latitude here in East Tennessee. And for some of you that's on here, that may vary a little bit depending on where you're tuning in from tonight. But make sure that you're selecting a cultivar that's going to perform well in that 35 to 40 degree latitude range. So bush beans, typically you can again sequentially plant those, and that's just going to give you a longer harvest throughout the season. And then what about fertilizing? And remember, because beans can or do have that ability to fix nitrogen, they're not going to be known as a heavy feeder. So you're not going to have to side dress them like you do for corn. So typically we're only going to fertilize beans at pre-plant. And then kind of like what you see here, cultivating for weed control is optimum. Again, you want to do that at a shallow depth because we don't want any root damage there. Especially for bush beans, adding a little addition of a straw mulch can really help reduce the weed pressure until they get on up bigger. I've had some home gardeners ask about using plastic. Typically, we won't recommend that just because we are direct seeding in rows. And we want to be able to maintain a consistent moisture. So adding a drip irrigation would be probably more suitable under straw than it would be under plastic. You're going to get into some cost with that as well. But much like corn, you're going to do about 1 to 2 inches of deep watering a week, kind of like you see here. Make sure that, when you plant, right after you plant, when those plants do start emerging, that's when you want to get your trellis system in place. That's when you want to get your drip systems in place, because you don't want to be out there fussing with your plants and maybe doing damage to them after they've gotten on up a little bit bigger, because they're very tender at that point. Now, what about harvesting? Do we harvest like this, or do we wait and harvest like this? And I would say it's kind of a matter of preference, I guess, especially depending on how you like the beans, or if you're just wanting the snaps. For snaps, I'd probably go for something more like this. It's going to be a lot easier to actually snap that bean versus this. It looks like it's gotten a little woody, hanging on the vine for too long. So you probably got a little bit, you're probably losing some texture. You'll have some toughness actually in that pod itself. But you can see how those beans are still what we would call immature. Some people like that pod to ripen on up so they get a fuller bean. But again, that's going to be a matter of taste, and that's going to vary probably for each one of you. But no matter what, though, when you harvest, just make sure that you're storing those about 40 to 45 degrees. Make sure you got high humidity. Typically about 1 week is how long you're going to get these. Now, if you're growing beans like greasies, the heirloom beans, you can harvest those after they've dried. You can actually let these dry on the vine like you see here. That's what we would call leather britches. So if you're interested in that, I've got some extra material in the Google Drive just on growing some of these greasies. Lima beans, you want to pick those seeds, or pick when the seeds have enlarged. Limas can be picked at a shelling stage, kind of like you see here, when that pod is still green, or even when it's dry and brittle. Again, it's just going to be a matter of preference. Make sure that you're storing those 37 to 41 degrees, high humidity again, up to about a week. If you're drying these beans, you can actually keep them for longer periods of time. Edamame, this is the one you're going to want to harvest when they're immature, in that fuzzy stage like you see here. You want them plump, full of beans, but still bright green. So we don't want this to be completely flat. Hopefully you can see those 3 very distinguishable lumps within that pod right there. And that's when we know that it's picking time. Harvest before they turn yellow, like you see here, for best quality. Once they get to this stage, you can't eat that skin. You're pretty much just going to have to shell them, because you can't even chew them at that point. Edamame, you can cook and shell those before eating, and depending on some cultivars, even afterwards. Now, when it comes to beans, just like corn, you're going to have to be scouting. That's going to be really critical. We've got a lot of issues that you're going to see, but don't let that scare you. So many of you have probably seen this if you've grown beans here in Northeast Tennessee, because that's feeding from this pesky little varmint here. This is the Mexican bean beetle. Despite its sunshiny yellow color, it doesn't really bring sunshine to our gardens. It brings a lot of wrath and hate, because we hate this thing. And it leaves this little sticky residue. sappy residue, so it makes everything sticky. And when you're out there trying to pick, and everything gets stuck to you, and there'll be different life cycles going on the plant, and it just really makes you lose your religion when you see these varmints come out. So you're gonna again see all stages of this critter. So be on the lookout. This is all the same pests that you're looking at right here. We do have some insecticides that you can use. Some people will still go back to dusting with 7. We do have the liquid 7 that's available. And actually in one of the publications, it's got all of those listed, because I'm drawing that all out of my brain and I can't remember everything right now. But either one of those is going to work. Just remember that if you're doing this for an extended period of time over the growing season, make sure you're rotating those chemicals too. Now, here's the best word of advice I can give you. And hopefully y'all are all going to come back when we do our session in August or September, but remove any overwintering sites from the garden. Clean it up, get all that residue out of there. If you know that you can get your compost pile hot enough, 130, you can get rid of this little booger and kind of recycle him. Otherwise, burn it, get it out of there, bury it, do something, but get any residue out of that garden, because otherwise they're just going to continue to overwinter. Now, what do I mean by that? If you've got trellis systems in place, or maybe you've put up fence posts with pie pans to scare the birds off, whatever that is, anything that's going to serve as a home for this little pest over the winter, we want to get that out of the garden, get that sanitized. Now, you may have seedlings emerging early that are going to look like this, and this is what I was referring to earlier as damping off. You can see those stem lesions, that necrotic pith. You're going to have to pull that seedling up out of the ground to really be able to see that, because most of the time this is going to occur right at the soil line and deeper. We can also get into a situation with a root rot that we call fusarium. That's a pathogen that's going to be in the soil. We also have to deal with molds and southern blight. So if you see an occurrence of this going on, especially in those young seedlings, bring those into the office, take them to your extension agent, let them take a peek at it and make sure you ain't got nothing really serious going on there. Sometimes I will even send samples like this off to the lab just to get an accurate identification, because if we get into a situation of blight or fusarium, that's something we need to know about. We don't want you planting back in that field for a little while. That doesn't happen often, so don't let that scare you. But do know that does, the potential for that does exist. So just don't take any chances. When we see a plant like this, we're going to call that a total loss, no matter if it's just damping off with it, which is really mild, or if it is something more serious. We're going to go ahead and pull those and wait to see what the culprit was, if we had to send off for a lab specimen, and try again. If you can avoid planting in a really wet area, don't plant after a hard rain, and then do crop rotation, and even planting behind a cover crop is going to be very beneficial to reduce this. The other thing that's going to prevent this is those fungicide coated seeds that I was talking about. That's going to really help alleviate some of that issue. Now, if you see spots like this is what we call water soaked spots on the leaf, and you're going to see this little halo. And then what happens is that this little brown part starts dropping out, and this is actually a bacterial disease, and this can actually even infect your bean pod. So if you're seeing that occurring both on foliage and pod, then often that's going to be a bacterial infection. So bacterial, that's going to be the hardest thing for us to control in a garden. It's just like us. Think about it. When we get a bacterial infection, we take antibiotics. We don't have a lot of antibiotics that we can actually put on beans, but we do have some recommendations that you're getting in that handout. So make sure you refer to that and kind of go in order of how those are listed. One thing that can really help mitigate this is that straw mulch that I was talking about, because it's what we call the splash up effect. So if we're not getting that splash up from bare soil onto that plant, we're reducing that bacterial splash up on that foliage. Now, the other big thing that's going to help is resistant cultivars. So if you know you've had this problem occurring in the past, make sure that you check that out. Look to see what it's resistant for. And then the other thing, copper is a really good friend to have if you're growing fruit or vegetables, because that's going to be an organic compound. Plus, it's going to help improve the symptoms of a bacterial infection. Now, notice I said improve. It's not going to eradicate it or annihilate it. It's just going to help improve the vitality of that plant. So keep. What about this one? This one here, you're going to get these really small yellow or white spots, and then you're going to see the, well, I don't know if you can really see this because it's kind of blurry, but these little browns, reddish spots are actually, you're going to feel those. You can actually rub your thumb across them because they're raised up. This is what we call rust. It's really prevalent. We see this a lot. You're going to see this on all parts of the plant. What this can cause is leaf drop. The biggest thing here to prevent this is resistant varieties, removing any infected debris. Get that out of your garden ASAP. If you see it, don't leave it, don't let it be. And then use a fungicide, something like Manzate, which has got mancozeb as that active ingredient. Don't worry about writing that down because you're going to get that handout that's going to spell out all this for you. And then this beautiful specimen, this is always my favorite in the garden, is a virus. The reason for that is you get this modeling appearance. You see all those curls and the stippling and little wrinkles. It'll appear to be stunted, but they perform all these pretty little mosaics. But one of the best things you can do for viruses, because there is no cure for viruses, is just making sure you're buying certified clean seed and make sure you're getting cultivars with resistance. And then in true form, I always believe in saving the best for last. So this is one that you're probably going to see more than any of the others combined. This is what we see more of here in East Tennessee. So this is anthracnose. And anthracnose, you're going to hear it on a lot of ornamental plants, vegetable plants, all that good stuff, fruit crops. But one way you can tell anthracnose, it's probably not a very good picture here, but it's almost salmon colored, coral colored. You get that reddish color to it. Anthracnose is the only disease that's really going to give us that salmon color. It can be spread through seed and crop debris in the field. So you hear that, field debris, crop debris. That's why we always want to be cleaning up behind us. Again, make sure that you're using clean seed, resistant varieties. If you do get into a situation like this, deep tillage can actually help annihilate some of that infected debris. Another thing to avoid, I keep talking about with corn and beans both using a drip. You've not heard me say overhead irrigate. We don't ever want to do that. That's just going to help the propensity of fungal pathogens to spread. But the other thing that it can do is really amp up anthracnose. So don't be doing any overhead irrigation. But again, all these things that I've talked about with corn and beans is making sure that we have resistant varieties, keep your garden area clean, and don't water over top. And those are three of the best things that you can do. And this is what it looks like. This is anthracnose on the leaf and on the bean again. So kind of skipping out of corn and beans and moving a little bit past that, I wanted to talk a little bit about legumes in broad context, because it is a very huge family. Again, it's the Fabaceae family. But legumes, you've actually got three different classes there. And we've spent most of our time talking about fresh beans. And of course, peas would be grown very similarly to how we do beans. Then we have what we call pulses, and this is what you'll see a lot out in the Pacific Northwest and in the Dakotas. Dried beans, dried peas, chickpeas, and lentils. And then we have soybeans and peanuts. And here's a fun one I just wanted to add in here. I don't know if anybody is growing this. We don't typically eat this here. It's used more of an ornamental, but just to kind of make you aware, it's a beautiful addition to draw in hummingbirds, but it's the scarlet runner bean. And it's an ancient cultivar coming to us from Mexico, which, much like corn smut, is eaten pretty commonly in that part of the world, also very common in Europe. And then this is our peanut plant. We've actually grown peanuts in our Boys and Girls Club garden. It's something fun for the kids to be able to grow, because not a lot of kids really realize that peanuts come from the ground. But it's a beautiful flower like you see here. And then that's what it looks like at harvest time. We do have a pretty huge cropping system in eastern North Carolina and in Georgia for peanuts. They are actually going to be the second most important legume, even though we don't directly eat those because they're going more into oil production, especially in West Africa and in France, being made into fondues because you got a lot of higher temperature properties for it to be able to separate out. And then peanut butter, that's a huge one for peanuts. So again, we don't directly eat those, but a lot of consumption with the peanut crop. The one big thing with peanuts, and a lot of research has been done on this in the past, is aflatoxin. That's something you may have heard about, just occurring in storage facilities, and you're starting to see that on labels of some natural produced peanut butters where it'll say that it's aflatoxin free. And that's just, again, going back to how that peanut has been stored. And then another thing just to kind of mention is the heirloom beans. I know we talked in detail about bush beans, half runner beans, pole beans. But if you've never really gotten into heirloom beans, I would highly recommend learning about these. They've been passed down for generations through families, and it's the stories of the families that are as inherently embedded in the plants as much as the taste itself. So when we think about heirlooms, they're typically going to be pole beans. They're going to require an enormous amount of structure, like you see here, huge trellis support. So you're going to get into a financial investment with some of these. They're not going to be a bush bean that's going to get 2 foot tall. So just be aware that they are going to require a lot of room to grow. Taste far better in my opinion, but I'm kind of I guess I'm kind of biased because this little bean right here on the left has actually been in my family for over a century. The Hill family greasy bean, pretty cool little story with that. But one last thing about heirloom or open pollinated, again, you can save those for seeds. One thing to kind of talk about greasies, you're going to notice probably more on this one than the other two, but you get that really shiny appearance. You get that sheen on that pod. And you can eat these green like this, or these are the type that you can just leave hanging on the vine to eat later that we know as leather riches. So if this sparks an interest, be sure to check out this book by Dr. Bill Bess. He's from the same community I grew up in, Western North Carolina, but become a professor at Berea, Kentucky, and runs the Sustainable Mountain Ag Center today in Berea. His son has kind of taken over some of the operations there, but he's still very much involved and has hundreds of bean seeds that he's collected from all over the South. So the one little thing I wanted to kind of leave y'all with, and I apologize if this bores any y'all can cut on out here. It won't hurt my feelings at all. But like I say, heirloom beans tell a story, and you're probably wondering who this fella is. And he too he's a cousin of mine. He and my mama were first cousins. So my papa had there was 12 of them. My papa was actually the youngest of 12, but Ben, who you see pictured here, his mama, my great aunt Cecil, is who you see here in the inset, and that's actually Ben on her lap. But she was the one that kind of made sure that our Hill family bean got passed down for generations. One reason that it's so popular is because of these prolific colors. I won't tell you the whole story. If you want to read it, it'll be in the PowerPoint. But it was one of these things, even as a small kid, I can remember Ben telling that they would pick out his mama would give them seeds to play with, and they would pull the black ones out and pretend they were black bulls, and they would have all their little farming equipment set up. And there's actually a couple of pictures. I just couldn't find those to put in the presentation, but not only were they a very important food source, but they were also a very important toy for all the little ones as the families grew up. So I just wanted to kind of share that with you and showcase my papa right here, the handsome young one right here on the end. That's where I get my look. No, I'm just kidding. Just playing with y'all. But anyway, with that, we're going to sign off for tonight. We're wishing you a very successful gardening season with corn and beans this year. Please remember that we're always here. If you have any questions at all, we want to help you be successful in everything that you do. So if you get some weird something growing on your corn and beans, don't hesitate to bring that in. Like I say, even if we need to throw that under a microscope or send that to the lab, we will do that to make sure we don't have anything pretty severe going on. So with that, I'm going to sign us off, but I'll be sending you a link to the Google Drive. There's a couple of videos that will be in there as soon as I get this one uploaded, hopefully tomorrow. And then for those that have asked about the potato, I got it uploaded finally today, so I'll send you that link as well. So with that, we'll sign off, but I will see you all at the end of the month when we do tomatoes. So I hope everyone has a good evening, and I will see y'all soon. Oops. Andrea, yes, the armyworm is in the same family. Oh yeah, let's see. I can put that in the drive. Japanese beetles.